I'm going to give you my take on Penn State. Saw the West Virginia game, saw most of the Illinois game, saw some of the UCLA game. It appeared to me the last 2 weeks, despite what the stats are telling us, that Penn State has addressed that explosive play issue on offense. The stats will tell that. I know that I saw a stat during the UCLA game. I don't know what it is after the completion of that game, but 16th in the nation in explosive plays after being number 111 last year. But in the Illinois and UCLA games, it very much had the feel of James Franklin determining early in that game, both games, you can't score on my defense, so we're going to pack it in, play it conservatively, maybe save some of the repertoire, some of the playbook, but you can't score on us. Illinois scored a quick touchdown in the first drive, well-orchestrated drive. Then after that, forget it, nothing. And obviously UCLA has, nothing to show on the offensive side of the ball this year. And that was it just reeked of conservative play calling and conservative approach, but understandably so.
Yeah, I mean, first off, the explosive play thing definitely it's been addressed and in a big way. I mean, like you said, going into the UCLA game, you ranked 16th nationally, and against the Bruins, even though the offense wasn't quite as explosive as it had been, and a big part of that was not having Nicholas Singleton, you still had 4 plays of at least 15 yards, which, I mean, obviously you want more than that, but in a game where you don't have your most explosive offensive weapon, you're going to take that. And James Franklin came out and said yesterday that barring any sort of setback this week, they fully anticipate Singleton being a full go on Saturday. I know he said after the UCLA game that, right up to kickoff, they expected to have him. And I honestly do think had USC been last Saturday and UCLA this week, I think Singleton would have played last week. I think he knew against the opponent that they were going to be fine without him. And like you said, Mark, the last 2 weeks, very much you got that vibe. Like they knew the defense wasn't giving up more than 7 points, and they called the game accordingly. And against UCLA, I give them a lot of credit too, because I think you look at that UCLA game, it's the week after Illinois, which was essentially a de facto whiteout, top 20 opponent, Big Ten conference opener. You have the big showdown at USC this week. Noon kickoff. That thing had sloppy sleepwalk sandwich game written all over it. UCLA, to their credit, played very hard that team's got a lot of holes, but they played hard. I will give them that. And Penn State's offense, once they woke up midway through the second quarter, they scored on their final 7 possessions. They scored 5 times, and one of the times they didn't is because they knelt the clock out. So once that offense hit a gear Saturday afternoon against the Bruins, they took off and went. And even against Illinois, if you make 2 field goals, 2 inside 40-yard field goals like college kickers need to make, and they have since made a change at kicker, you win that game by 20, and it looks a lot different too. But I will give Andy Koldernicki a lot of credit for both of those games, the offense coordinator, because against Illinois, it was very clear that for whatever reason, Drew Allar was just off just enough that night, and he knew that they could maul Illinois in the trenches, and that's what they did, and just ran the ball down their throats. And against UCLA, again, to their credit, they played hard. Penn State struggled to run the ball at times, but Drew Allar was the complete opposite of what he was against Illinois. He was locked in. He looked really good. And, they hit a couple big pass plays. All 4 of their plays of 15-plus yards against UCLA came through the air. You saw Trey Wallace being explosive again. You saw Liam Clifford have his first career 100-yard game, including a 57-yard catch. So, yeah, the explosiveness has been fixed. And, like you said, I think the last 2 weeks it was very much they knew the defense wasn't going to give up more than a touchdown. They knew that they probably could keep some things under wraps offensively that they can bust out this weekend and then against Ohio State in a couple of weeks. And just the coaching staff did what good coaching staffs do. They saw where they had the advantage. They saw where they could exploit their opponent, and they exploited their opponent and won. And, people can gripe all they want about only beating a top 20 Illinois team by 14, by only beating UCLA by 16. That's back-to-back Big Ten wins by a combined 30 points. And when you look at everything else that happened on Saturday, it was one of those Saturdays in college football. So, you should be happy to get out with a victory, especially a double-digit victory over a conference opponent.
So Marty, I think you can tell I'm not giving USC a whole lot of a chance this week. I'm not going to pretend that I'm leaning to USC. I definitely think Penn State wins this game. I'm not going to say lock of the week, but I'm pretty solidly on the Penn State side, purely in terms of predicting which team will win. So I just want to put that out there. That said, if I'm in a Penn State mindset, if I'm on the Penn State side, and obviously you cover Penn State, my worry is that Illinois and UCLA on offense will not prepare Penn State for what they're going to see from USC in terms of the difference in skill level. I mean, there is a lot of talent on this USC side. So how concerned do you think Penn State is? How concerned do you think Penn State should be about the significant jump in overall playmaking talent and potency that Penn State's going to see from the Trojans?
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate point because you look at this USC passing attack. I mean, personally, I would argue that because of the difference in quarterback play, this is the best passing attack they'll face all year, even a little bit more so than Ohio State. Because I think Ohio State has better receivers. USC receivers are no slouches themselves, but from a passing standpoint, I would take Miller Moss over Will Howard any day of the week. That said, I also think that if you look at where Penn State's defense potentially has some weaknesses, it's at linebacker. That's an area you worry about USC exploiting the middle of the field. And the secondary has played really, really well without KJ Winston, but this is the first test against a really good passing attack without your preseason All-American safety. Until you see it, you're going to have some concerns back there. So I think if you're Tom Allen in this defense, that's where your concerns are coming into this, is you have some injuries at linebacker, and linebacker was a question mark coming into the year to begin with. And without Winston at safety, how are you going to defend this USC passing attack? I think what's going to be important is getting this pass rush home because, like you said, this is going to be a much different offense they saw with Illinois, definitely much different than what they saw with UCLA. So those games didn't prepare them for this. But I think if you're Penn State, you need to come out, obviously be thinking pass first throughout this game. You're going to probably put a lot on your corners in this game. A.J. Harris, Jalen Kimber, Cam Miller, they've all played extremely well this year to help alleviate some pressure off the younger safeties who are going to be out there in the absence of KJ Winston. And I think what's going to be most important is getting that pass rush home. And I mean, obviously we'll get into this, but I don't think there's anywhere on this field where the gap between the two sides may be wider than in the trenches. So I think that's where Penn State's going to feel good about it is, you might put your secondary in some tough spots against some really good receivers and a really good quarterback, but you're going to trust your defensive line to win more times than not on Saturday afternoon.
Now, USC, as I mentioned at the top of the show, no Eric Gentry, no Bear Alexander, not because of injury, but because he redshirted and has declared to enter the portal. And then you lose Anthony Lucas late in that Minnesota game, and it obviously had an effect. And, in terms of like USC maybe not being prepared for the level of talent it's going to face against Penn State, but Drew Aller is a few notches better than Brosmer of Minnesota, than Braden Locke of Wisconsin. So from my own USC vantage point, I'm worried that Drew Aller is going to be a few steps up in weight class as a quarterback. How much do you think Penn State's passing game can feast on what is an undermanned USC defense at this point?
I think if they're clicking, it can, because we've seen at times this year this passing game look really good. I mean, James Franklin will tell you up and down, and I have a hard time disagreeing with him, that Tyler Warren is the best tight end in the country, and he is an absolute weapon on this offense. And the receivers, I mean, anyone who watched me with Mark throughout the offseason, we talked about the wide receiver position up and down. And to their credit, they have taken a huge step this year. They're still not where you want them to be, but Trey Wallace has emerged as a legitimate top-of-the-line guy. Liam Clifford keeps getting better. Julian Fleming is starting to look a lot more settled into this offense, and Omari Evans has been the home run guy. I do wonder, Evans is one I really think they could use on Saturday because, as you mentioned, you have some question marks in this USC defense, or in the secondary, they may be a little depleted. Evans is the fastest guy on the team. I think he's got, off the top of my head, I'm going to say he has 3 catches of 50-plus yards this year already. And he's also drawn a couple pass interferences. So he's been good at go take the top off the defense and either run past them and catch it or draw a flag. So I'll be curious to see if that's something, especially early in the game, where if you're Penn State and you want to come out and try and take this thing by the throat, if we see a deep shot there. Now, all of that said, and I have a lot of faith in Drew Aller, he has been much, much better this year than last year. the best road game of his career was at Maryland last year. And, some USC fans who are disgruntled might disagree with this right now, but I still feel very confident saying USC is a better team than Maryland. So you still want to see him do it on the road against a good team. I mean, he had a good game this year against West Virginia, so maybe I should give him that one because this West Virginia squad, I think, is still probably going to wind up winning like 8 or so games in the Big 12. But until you see him really do it on the road against a quality conference opponent, that's the one thing we still haven't really seen from Drew yet. So I think this is a big chance for him this weekend, too, to kind of silence some people on that front. I mean, obviously, this game doesn't look as formidable and intimidating as it did a week ago at this time, but it's still USC. They're still a brand name. You're in the Coliseum. If you come out and put up big numbers, that's going to do a lot for you. But we need to see that from him. But I am confident in their ability to get the passing game going on Saturday as long as they can get out of their own way. Because a lot of times this year in the passing game has struggled. It's been self-inflicted. Against UCLA, for example, first drive of the game, second snap of the game, Drew has Julian Fleming open for about a 20-yard gain. Fleming drops the ball. And in the next route, Fleming should have cut the route off a little bit sooner than he did. Throw goes behind him. Had he cut that route off when he should have, it's a big gain and a first down. So they've struggled at times to kind of get it into rhythm, but once that passing game has gotten into rhythm, they've done very well.
How much is James Franklin emphasizing the need to have quicker starts? And here at USC, there's been first half USC and second half USC, and USC needs to play 30 bad minutes to finally wake up. And USC is the best third quarter team in the country, or at least one of. USC has played extremely strong third quarters across the board this season, but it just can't get the engines going in the first half, and especially the first quarter. And Penn State, like I've noticed, I haven't watched your games really closely, but the offense took time to get going against UCLA, didn't have the great first quarter against Illinois. How much of a talking point, how much of a point of emphasis is it for Penn State? Hey, we need to start playing strong first quarters, strong first halves.
Yeah, that was something James talked a lot about at his press conference this week, is that fast start. Because, like you've said, that's offensively, that's been a problem, these slow starts. And most of these games, once the offense has gotten into a rhythm, they've rolled. Like I said, 5 out of 6 drives against UCLA, they scored. Against West Virginia, I think it was something like 4 out of 5, 5 out of 6 as well. Once the offense got going, they were fine. But, USC is a team where I'm sure this Saturday they know this is do or die for the 2024 season for USC. And, I would like to think that Lincoln Riley is going to rally the troops and they're going to come out and play like it. And that's the kind of scenario where a slow start, you could find yourself in a 14-0 kind of hole real quick. So, yeah, that has definitely been a point of emphasis. Now, one thing James Franklin's also mentioned, and I don't think he necessarily wants this trend to continue, but in 2016, when Penn State last won the Big Ten, that's how they were. They were a second half team. They would start slow almost every week and rally in the second half. But, eventually that's going to bite you. And that year it bit them in the Pitt game, and that Pitt game kept them out of the playoff. Now, obviously the playoff thing is much different now than it was in 2016, but at the same time, that is definitely an emphasis. I think a big emphasis this week for Penn State is getting off to a faster start. And to circle back to our conversation about the passing game, that's part of the reason why I wonder if we see an attempted deep shot early in the first quarter from Penn State. Kind of in a way, let's get Drew in a rhythm, let's get some confidence, let's get some points on the board and see if maybe that can help jumpstart this offense a little bit quicker.
We do appreciate you all being here at the Voice of College Football. We get together every Tuesday and Friday. So the big call-in show with Tim and Matt is on Friday. That's at 10 Eastern, 7 Pacific. Again, Trojan Conquest. We're right here with all the big topics concerning USC football in a must-win situation. Marty just said it. There we go, Tim. Matt, we put the bar at 10-2. All we had to do is look at the 10-year history of the 14 playoff and extend that to 12 in terms of what the committee has done. There would only be one 9-3 team ever make the playoff, and that's been that dividing line, and USC has no room for error for what most people, I think, would have considered, especially if we could rewind back to third quarter, early fourth quarter at the Big House, when USC was feeling good about itself, an LSU win in hand, and a Michigan win appeared to be in hand, but things have gone sour now with 2 losses in 3 games, and again, no room for error.
No, that's exactly where the Trojans are, and you just have to wonder in this 12-team playoff era. Like the guys in the locker room know that 10-2 is what they probably needed to make the playoff, and like this is a pride game. I mean, it might seem cliche, but you're not really thinking, oh, if we win this game, we can make the playoff. I mean, narrowly, technically, that's true, but it's more a matter of, hey, we just need to be USC. We just need to, take pride in this jersey, this uniform that we're wearing. We're playing Penn State on national television. We just need to start playing well. And because USC just has not played a complete 60-minute game against a reasonably good team yet this season. And when you look at where Lincoln Riley's failing, I mean, I'm seeing a lot of people in the chat criticize the play selection. There are going to be a couple plays in a game where the coach doesn't dial up the right play. The number one thing, and by the way, it's not the offensive line, like that's number 2. The number one thing is accountability. I mean, and it's there on defense, but it is not there on offense. Dropped passes week after week, blown missed assignments by the offensive line week after week. Guys not communicating week after week. Guys not being ready in the first quarter week after week. The elite coaches get accountability on a relatively consistent basis. It's not going to happen all the time. Like we saw Kalen DeBoer in Alabama trip up against Vanderbilt. You will see any coach is going to have a bad day. His team steps into a pothole. That happens. But like most of the time, Kalen DeBoer is on it, right? The 6-0 record against Sark, Kirby, and Lanning combined. Like he's a legit heavyweight coach. Lincoln Riley was a heavyweight coach. He's losing the mustard on his fastball, and he's losing it. We can look at the micro, but the macro is the lack of accountability, the not having players ready to weed out mistakes at the start of games. So like that is fundamentally where USC is falling short. So Marty, turning the conversation back to Saturday's game, like what would you say are your foremost points of concern and your foremost points of optimism for the Nittany Lions?
I think my main point of concern, the USC being in the position they're in, I think is part of a concern if you're Penn State. I think honestly, if you're Penn State, you would have rathered the referees rolled that Brosmer short on that sneak on Saturday night and USC pulled that thing out in overtime, because I think you'd be getting a lot less desperate of a USC team. And anytime you're playing a desperate team, especially on the road, and a desperate team with talent, that's always tricky. And again, like I said, this passing game, because the best, it sounds weird to say, but it's probably the truth. The best passing game I think Penn State's faced this year is Bowling Green, and for a half, Bowling Green got to have their way with the secondary. Now, there were a lot of factors in that game. They were having a ton of issues in the first half with the headsets getting play calls in. So at halftime, they completely scrapped how they were getting their play calls in on defense. And in the second half, they only gave up like 60 yards or something. So I think that was probably a major, major problem. But again, like we said earlier, until you see this secondary, especially without their best player, go against a formidable passing attack like this and have success, you're going to have concerns. And I think one other, maybe not a true concern because it's probably more of a coincidence than anything, but probably worth mentioning, the last 2 times Penn State climbed into the top 4 was 2021, where they go to number 4 and then immediately go to Kinnick Stadium and lose. And in 2019, where they got to number 4 and then immediately went to Minneapolis and lost to Minnesota. So the last 2 times they've gotten into the top 4, they've gone on the road the next week and lost to a conference opponent. Now, different scenarios. Both of those teams, Iowa and Minnesota, are both undefeated. And Sean Clifford got hurt in that Iowa game. But still, I can guarantee you that is something James Franklin will be harping on behind the scenes this week, because that's just the kind of guy he is. For the optimism, for me, the biggest thing is in the trenches. I think Penn State is so much better, both on the offense and defensive line, than USC, from what I've seen this year from USC, having watched the Michigan and the Minnesota games. And even the LSU game, where I thought Danton Lynn did a nice job of baiting LSU into throwing the ball a lot more in the second half than they needed to, where I think if LSU would have stuck with the run more, that game may have gone differently. So I'm very confident in Penn State's ability to win in the trenches. And, ultimately it's football. You win in the trenches, you're probably going to win the game. And also, as wild as it sounds for anybody to be saying this, like at this point, I'm not sure. I think overall Penn State has a coaching advantage. I'm not necessarily going to say James Franklin's a better head coach than Lincoln Riley because Lincoln has still accomplished more. But I mean, right now there are a few play callers in the country I would trust more than Andy Kotelnicki in a game. And while USC's defense has come a long, long way, obviously he's a Penn State guy. I'm very high on Danton Lynn. I think he's got an extremely bright future. Tom Allen's been there, done that, and we've seen Tom Allen with a lot less talented defenses than he has this year shut down teams on the road before. So I think those would be my points of optimism for Penn State. But like I said, the biggest one to me is just in the trenches because Penn State's offensive line has played extremely well this year. Their defensive line has been even better, and I just have a really hard time seeing USC being able to consistently block them and hold up against them. There's been a lot of people in Penn State circles this week who have kind of referenced the 2022 Auburn game, talking about this, where that was a game that at halftime was 14-6, and then you looked up in the second half and it was 41-12. Because in the second half, Penn State just wore Auburn down in the trenches, and the depth differential took over. I'm not saying I think that's going to happen because I don't think they win by 29 or whatever it was, but I do think that's a comparison and a mindset a lot of people in Penn State circles have because of the optimism around the differences in the trenches here.
So go ahead, Mark.
I was checking out Wikipedia because I'm usually pretty good about figuring out, and with all these crazy conference scenarios now, like with Miami going out to Cal for an ACC game, we determined that the last time Miami was on the West Coast for a conference game was way back in 2000. And I was thinking, when has Penn State gone to Washington State? I'm going down the coast, and I'm thinking their last trip for a regular season game on the West Coast had to be at USC. And sure enough, it appears to be in 1991, the last time Penn State went out to USC. Has James Franklin talked at all about this? I remember him at Big Ten Media Days being asked about travel and, them really looking at it. And so did he mention anything this week about how that weekly schedule may be adjusted this week?
He hasn't mentioned too much other than the fact they plan to fly out on Thursday. They were debating some of their travel plans. What they're going to do is, instead of flying out of State College, and for those who don't know, State College is a tiny airport. It is a pain in the butt to get in and out of. They're actually going to travel to Harrisburg on Thursday, fly out of Harrisburg so they can get there on Thursday and have all day Friday to adjust in terms of the time difference and a potential jet lag, which, I mean, obviously anyone who travels knows that when you're traveling that far, the jet lag is much more severe when you're losing the hours than gaining it, but your body still needs to adjust to the time zone. But outside of that, I don't expect too much to be different. They had practice tonight in Haluba Hall. They will have their open session for the media on Wednesday still. I'm sure they will still do their usual Friday and Saturday, just they'll be doing it out in Los Angeles. And I think some of that is James is such a freak of nature when it comes to this stuff. That's part of what makes him so successful is he preaches that 1-0 mentality, and as goofy as it sounds, it works. So I think he wants to keep to his schedule as best as possible this week. So other than Thursday being a travel day where they'll be flying from Harrisburg to LAX, I don't think too much is really going to be out of the norm for them this week, or at least, as close to normal as you possibly can be when one of the days in your week has to involve flying to the other side of the country.
I did see a stat from John Wilner, the Wilner hotline, that the Big Ten teams that have traveled 2 or more time zones are 1-7 so far.
I did see that as well. Yeah,
that was an eye grabber. So it'll be interesting to see what happens this weekend. All right, let's get into tactics a little bit and the coordinators specifically. How do you think Danton Lynn is going to go at this Penn State offense? Like knowing what you know about Danton Lynn, seeing what you've seen of him, how he operates, what do you think Danton Lynn's going to try to do for Penn State, and how do you think Kotelnicki counters? Like, how do you think the chess match between Danton Lynn and Andy Kotelnicki, like that is appointment television on CBS.
I agree. Yeah, two
so how do you think that chess match is going to unfold?
Yeah, I agree with you. It's appointment television. 2 of the brightest young minds in the country. One of the best up and rising offense coordinators, one of the best up and rising defense coordinators. I'm very curious to see what Lynn does, because if I'm playing Penn State even with the steps the passing game has taken, I am still, at least to start the game, you're going to beat me throwing the ball. I am not letting Nick Singleton and Katron Allen beat me. I will move my safeties up. I will put an extra guy in the box. I will put my corners out there against your receivers and trust them to make plays. And if that's not working, I'll adjust. So I'm going to be curious to see if Lynn takes an approach like that, because as you mentioned earlier, there's some serious concerns about the current state of the USC secondary. So I wonder then too, and I'm not sure how much of this he's done based off of what I've watched of him, especially that Michigan game. You can almost throw the entire defensive game plan out the window because Michigan was essentially running the triple option. How aggressive does he get maybe with blitzing to try and disrupt Drew Aller? Because that's when Drew does struggle at times if he doesn't have a clean pocket. And I mean, again, this is most quarterbacks, but if he doesn't have a super clean pocket, sometimes he can rush. He doesn't go through his reads well. And if it's like, hey, you know what? We don't necessarily trust our secondary to hold up. Let's just try and get to the quarterback and not give him time to make plays and make reads and make throws. So I'll be very curious to see how he goes about that. As for Kotelnicki, again, like I mentioned earlier, I wouldn't be surprised to see Penn State come out and try a shot play early to be aggressive, to get into a groove and get over the slow start. I also think you're going to see Nicholas Singleton, again, assuming he is 100%, which seems like that's what they expect, see a heavy dose of him early, because I don't think it's a coincidence that against UCLA when they didn't have him was when the offense really started slow as opposed to other games. So I think you're going to see a lot of Nick Singleton. I think you're going to see them take some deep shots early. And I will be very curious also. They have talked a lot about the Bo Pribula package. Bo Pribula is their backup quarterback who is the laziest comparison in the world as people compare him to Tracy McSorley. He's a better runner than he's a thrower. He wears number 9. He's about a 6-foot tall white dude. Like, he is Trace 2.0. And we've seen some of the Pribula package this year, but it's been very vanilla. Bo takes it's 3rd and 2, and you run it with him because you get the extra blocker to get the first down. I think he's only thrown it out of it a couple times. I'm very curious to see if they have anything dialed up out of that we haven't seen yet, because we've seen a lot of it where Drew stays on the field and is flanked out wide. Do you maybe get a double pass or something out of that? Because Kotelnicki, I know at Kansas, that was one of his trademarks, was the creativity and the trick play. So I'll be very interested to see if he has anything of that sort up his sleeve on Saturday as well. Again, especially if you are in a position where you want to jumpstart this offense, or maybe you come out early and get 14-0, 14-3, and maybe see an opportunity to go for an early jugular. Does he pull something out of the bag of tricks? So that's something I'll be watching closely with Kotelnicki on Saturday as well.
Now, to the other side, I can just imagine, I can envision Tom Allen having saliva dripping from the side of his mouth, looking at that Swiss cheese USC offensive line. So how do you think Tom Allen is going to try to exploit USC's weakness up front? Do you think that Allen is going to try and use a lot of stunts and twists to get USC into those communication situations where you have USC's had situations, especially against Wisconsin 2 weeks ago. 2 guys focus on one rusher and then the other guy comes in free. Or do you think Tom Allen tries to keep it simple? You know what? We're just going to bring our base front 4. We think we can win with those guys, and we're going to keep people in coverage to focus on not getting beaten by USC's receivers. So you think Tom Allen goes exotic in the attempt to just confuse USC right from the start? Or do you think he kind of hangs back first quarter at least, hopes that his base front 4 can do the job, because then he can just have so many guys back in coverage to make sure that Miller Moss won't have a deep shot all day? How do you think Tom Allen plays this?
From what I've seen of Tom Allen this year, and I mean, obviously as a Big Ten guy, I watched a lot of Tom Allen defense over the years, well before he's at Penn State. I personally would guess he probably starts in that base, largely because he knows Penn State has advantage in the trenches. And not just that, it's a deep group. Penn State's going to rotate 5 guys at defensive tackle. They're going to rotate 4 guys at defensive end, all of which they're confident in, all of which they view as future NFL guys with potentially 2 future first-round picks out of that group. It's a very deep, talented group. So I think you're going to see him start out with that, trusting that front 4 to make plays. And if that's not working, I think that's when you're going to see them maybe get a bit more exotic, bring a linebacker. I could see Tony Rojas, their will linebacker, being used to blitz a lot, or potentially Jalen Reed walking up from safety to kind of play more of that Sam linebacker safety hybrid and being used as a blitzer. In that scenario, you can still drop 6 in the coverage. I also think Saturday is going to be a game where you're going to see Abdul Carter deployed all over the field. I don't think it's going to be just straight lineup at defensive end. We saw a lot of that against Illinois also. Something they used to do with Micah Parsons a lot back in the day, something they started to do with Carter some last year and continued this year, is stand him up over the center or in an A or B gap and just cut him loose and, wish that interior offensive line the best of luck. And, the stats haven't always been there this year for Carter, but there's been a lot of TFLs and a lot of sacks and quarterback hits and pressures that have happened because they do that with Carter. And all of a sudden you've got a center, a guard, and a running back all focused on him. So it frees up somebody else. So I think you're going to see Abdul Carter deployed all over the field as well in pass rush situations. So I think you're going to see Allen, like I said, try and start basic because he knows his defensive line has an advantage over this USC offensive line. And then if that's not working, get a little bit more exotic with the blitzing potentially. But even this year, when the few times that the defensive line has kind of struggled to get into a gear or get home early in games, he stayed away from the exotic blitzing because I think Allen is a guy who really does like to run that man coverage and knows that if you blitz in, you blitz paired with that, you're putting yourself in a tough spot. So I think he'll start base. We're going to see Carter, I think, deployed all up and down the line in pass rush situations. And, just a lot of stunts and twists, just, the basic. Nothing super exotic, but exotic enough that it can confuse an offensive line, especially if you're already maybe on your heels a little bit, like I think he's probably anticipating happening.
I was just going to say, I'm reminded that during the offseason leading into week 1, our buddy Steve Merrill of Wager Talk, our resident odds maker, handicapper, and I were recording a segment on Heisman candidates. And then he was going through the recent history of Heisman candidates and basically making the case that your money is best placed on not the leading candidate or the number 2 guy, 3 guy, but it's usually a guy way down the list. Devontae Smith and others have jumped from 25, 30, 35 to 1 shots. And it's ironic that he asked me, he said, okay, Mark, give me 2 guys that you think could win the Heisman that are way down this board. And I said, Drew Aller and Miller Moss. Well, neither one of those guys is going to win the Heisman this year. But my point is they are facing this week. And Dillon Gabriel, if you ask most college football fans, in a marginal college football quarterback conference, most fans would say Dillon Gabriel is the best quarterback because he gets the Lifetime Achievement Award. He's the most prolific. I don't know that he's the best quarterback in the conference, especially based on what I saw against Michigan State last week. I'm not saying that he's not the best, but these two definitely have a shot. Do we think that there is any separation between these two? I think they're extremely comparable.
My response would simply be that Aller has the better offensive line, and I think the offensive lines magnify what these quarterbacks are and aren't able to do. When we look at Miller Moss, he was always going to need help. He's not the guy who does everything. He's the guy who works within the structure of the offense. Look at the Holiday Bowl against Louisville. Look at the LSU game. When he got enough time to throw, when his teammates did their jobs, they put Miller Moss in position to succeed, and he'll make the right throw. He's not getting the help. It's not a verdict on Miller Moss. It's a verdict on USC's offensive line and on Lincoln Riley not putting Miller Moss in the best possible position to succeed. And Marty can speak to Drew Aller more particularly, but the larger point that I'm making is pretty clear. It's not so much the quarterback himself, is that if a quarterback is not Caleb Williams, if he's not Jaden Daniels, if he's not Jalen Milroe, guy who can do so many different things and take a bigger burden on his shoulders. If a quarterback is not cut in that mold, he's going to need the help from his teammates. So what the verdict is on Aller at Penn State, I'm going to leave that one to Marty.
Yeah, I agree with the offensive line thing completely, Matt. Honestly, I feel like if you could take Penn State's offensive line, combine it with USC's receivers, then throw in Nicholas Singleton, you'd have the dream scenario for a quarterback. But Yeah, I think that's where it's interesting to me because Miller Moss obviously has the better receivers. Drew clearly has the better offensive line, and then running backs and running game to go with it. From a pure talent standpoint, I still think Drew probably is a little bit better, but in my opinion, there are very few quarterbacks in the country, if any, who have the just pure God-given ability and arm talent of Drew Aller. That said, I think anyone who would take Miller Moss over Drew, I can understand that because you've kind of seen more in game from Moss. And now I think some of that is the system Lincoln Riley runs. I think some of that this year has been he's had to do it because USC hasn't really had too many of their options offensively. Again, circling back to the offensive line and the running game. But like you said, unfortunately, Miller Moss, and again, not a knock on him, is not the quarterback who's built to do that. Is Drew Aller a quarterback who's built to have to put the team on his back and carry them week in and week out if need be? We don't know. And part of it is because with the way Penn State's built, you don't need to know because they have an offensive line and they have a running game that most weeks is going to be there. So, yeah, I think that, and again, I've hit it throughout the show where to me the biggest difference is in the trenches, and I think that's the biggest difference between these teams. Because if you look at these teams up and down, I don't think they're that much different in overall talent. I mean, I think Penn State's defense definitely is still a step or so ahead of USC's, but I think USC with a little bit better offensive line play, the gap between their offense and Penn State's would be, somewhat significant also. So again, football so many times from Pee Wee on up is going to come down to play in the trenches. And that's, to me, where the biggest gap is between these teams. And that's why I agree with what you said earlier, Matt, too, that I think Penn State probably winds up winning this game on Saturday.
Matt, it was a narrative all off season, but even going back to the time that it was announced that these West Coast teams were moving into the Big Ten and just these enormous Big Ten fan bases descending on various points out west. Yes, we're looking at you first and foremost, UCLA, and just taking over the stadium. UCLA was the easy target, of course. USC dropping a second game. Do you think the fan base may be teetering on the point that Penn State is going to be plucking up tickets and making it much less of a home field advantage?
I certainly think there's if you live in central Pennsylvania or Pittsburgh or Philadelphia and you're a Nittany Lion fan, you should be checking flights to LA. I mean, I'll just leave it at that, right? Because, during the Pete Carroll heyday, when everything was rocking and rolling and the program was an unquestioned heavyweight, the Coliseum was stuffed to the gills. But yeah, 2 losses before the middle of October. I think there are going to be plenty of Penn State fans there, or at the very least, there are going to be plenty of tickets to be had. So if you're a Penn State fan watching this show here at the Voice of College Football, and you're thinking, what are my chances of getting a decent seat? I'd say those chances are pretty good.
Yeah, and I'll build off that real quick. I will say, I think when this schedule came out, this was a game that a lot of Penn State fans in general circled anyway. The weather around here hasn't been too bad lately, but typically the middle of October, the weather in LA is a hell of a lot nicer than anywhere else in Pennsylvania. So I think you combine that with what people probably circled as, hey, this should be a good game, 2 really good programs, 2 kind of iconic programs. Obviously this was eons ago now in the world of college football, but the last time these 2 played, it was an instant classic. I think for a lot of reasons, this was a game that a lot of Penn State fans probably circled back in the offseason anyway as, hey, our yearly road trip game, let's try and get out to the Coliseum this year. So, I won't be stunned if there is a decent amount of white in the stands on Saturday.
One last thing from me, and Marty, you've heard this so many times, I don't even expect you to really respond to it, but I'm watching the Fox broadcast, and of course, it was UCLA, so it was basically over from the first series. We knew what it was going to be, but much of that time was spent on, has Penn State done what it needs to do to catch Ohio State and Michigan? Well, they don't play Michigan this year. And then the thought is also, does it matter that they've caught Ohio State and Michigan this year? Because we got a 12-team playoff, and they're going to play different teams in the playoff, and they don't have to be the best team in the Big Ten. They can be the third or fourth best team in the Big Ten and then catch fire and do it during the playoff. I don't even know what I'm asking you there. I just that again is just a narrative that is recycled, but with a different spin at least this year because of the 12-team playoff.
Yeah, and it's a narrative. Like I can even say on our boards at Happy Valley Insider, if a kid commits, you'll have 7 comments right about, well, is he good enough to beat Ohio State? Could this kid play at Ohio State? Would Ohio State offer this kid? And I'm like, well, you can go look at his offer list. A lot of times they do have Ohio State offers. Yes, like it's definitely the narrative, but yeah, again, to me, it's in the 12-team playoff. Like, yes, you still want to beat Ohio State, but it's not as pertinent as it once was. You know, if you're, and I think that's part of what makes this an important game for Penn State too. Because if you look at their remaining schedule after this, if Penn State wins this game on Saturday, in my opinion, at least something has to go catastrophically wrong for them not to go at least 11-1. And at 11-1 in the Big Ten, you're not only in the playoff, in my opinion, you're probably comfortably playing at home in the first round. So, yeah, it is what it is. I mean, people are always going to have that Ohio State bug up their butt, I think. And I honestly think so much of it, not to get too far off on it here, but it goes back to when Penn State first came to the Big Ten. Because before Penn State joined the Big Ten, anyone the first decade or so in the Big Ten, they were a perennial powerhouse. They were a top 5 program year in and year out, and playing that kind of Eastern-based independent schedule. Once Pitt started to fall off in the 80s, they didn't really have too much competition. Well, when you got to the Big Ten, and you had the John Cooper years at first, so Ohio State wasn't really Ohio State there for a few years. Once the Tressel years kicked in, that kind of aligned with Penn State taking a step back for the last few years of Paterno. And I think that's just kind of always set wrong with a lot of Penn State fans, where for so long, Penn State was that dominant program week in, week out on their schedule. Once they kind of got replaced by Ohio State as that, I think that's always kind of created this natural animosity. And then you just, with what Ohio State has become and Penn State only having won one side of the last 10 years or whatever it is, it's a disdain that I think is built on respect, because Ohio State is what so many Penn State fans want Penn State to be and aspire for Penn State to be. But the problem is there's like 4 Ohio States in the country. So, you know, in the 12-team playoff era, like you said, it's I'm not even sure where you go with it, but if you're consistently winning 10 games in the Big Ten, and should this matter? No, but you know it does. When you've got the name brand of a Penn State slapped beside those 10 wins, you're going to make it a lot of times.